Politics aside, the humanitarian crisis is deepening in Gaza, reaching alarming levels as shelters for civilians are bombed. For more on this, we're joined by Sunjeev Bery. He's an advocacy director for the Middle East and North Africa with Amnesty International USA. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You just saw this last report, another Israeli strike on a UN-sponsored school. The United States and the UN are condemning this. Just want to get your reaction, because you've said in the past that war crimes on both sides are being committed.
Absolutely. The Hamas firing of indiscriminate rockets into Israel, rockets that are unguided and don't differentiate between combatants and civilians, that's a war crime. It's also, however, by the same token, a war crime if Israel is using artillery shells in densely populated areas, which are by their very nature going to cause civilian deaths.
So how does that issue get addressed when there's so much immediate need in other areas? You see all the people that are displaced. They really don't have any place to go, not to mention lack of resources, food, water, aid, that sort of thing.
Well, that's a very important question. I mean, both Israel and Egypt need to open up borders to allow those who are sick to be able to leave, those who are injured to be able to leave. But even more than that, Israel needs to make sure that it is not using or engaging in any of these sorts of war crimes, given the sheer number of military strikes that Israel has launched in the Gaza Strip. One of the worst examples is that Gaza's main power supply, its main power plant, has now been hit, very likely by Israel, which would be a definite war crime, plunging the entire territory into a state of power without any electricity for as many as 22 to 24 hours a day.
Again, but how does the war crime issue get addressed? Is that something that takes place later once there's a ceasefire and things de-escalate and calm down?
Well, given the horrible records on the parts of all of the parties to this conflict, Israel, Hamas, and Palestinian armed groups, it's important that no external party, no external country supply any weapons to any of the parties to the conflict. There needs to be a UN arms embargo, and for governments like that of the United States, it's important to go beyond talk. Instead of just talking about a ceasefire, the U.S. needs to stop sending weapons to Israel.
You have said that in the past, asked the UN for a full arms embargo. Do you feel, as many others have said, that the UN has not been effective in dealing with this crisis? There's been so much talk.
Absolutely. I mean, certain agencies of the UN have done a very good job of getting information out. The UN agencies that work directly with Gaza Palestinian civilian populations. So right now, 10% of Gaza's civilian population is currently being housed in UN facilities. They fled their homes. But on the other hand, the UN as a political body is divided in part because countries like the United States have historically blocked UN pressure on the parties to the conflict.
So what needs to happen next? Short ceasefires haven't worked. We've seen a couple of those already. The fighting continues. So would a longer ceasefire even hold? What do you hope happens next here? I mean, it's just getting worse.
It's getting worse. One thing that needs to happen is that the UN Human Rights Council, which has called for an investigation and authorized it, that needs to move forward, and all the parties to the conflict need to get out of the way of that investigation. Second, all of the weapon supplies need to be cut off. There needs to be that embargo so that the bullets run out, the bombs run out, the missiles run out, the rockets run out. And then third, there needs to be a heightened effort to lift the Gaza blockade that Israel has maintained on the Gaza Strip for 7 years.
Arms embargo, easier said than done?
It's definitely a tough hill to climb because of the history of so many parties flooding weapons to Israel as well as Hamas.
All right, Sunjeev Bery, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.